Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Workforce Wednesday. Today, our topic is multi-generational teaching. Our presenter is Joy Felix, and she's a career navigator with Northeast ISD Adult Education and Literacy, and they are with the Alamo Consortium in San Antonio. And I want to welcome our presenter today. Our presenter is Joy Felix. And Joy studied psychology and sociology in her undergrad, and she switched fields after graduation and holds an MA in TESOL with certificates in international relations and linguistics. At this time, transfer the right to Joy. Joy, take it away.
Hi, how is everybody today? This presentation is on preparing students for the multi-generational workforce. When talking with a lot of the different workforce that we work with throughout the city of San Antonio, we're finding that there's a lot of problems as the newer generation is moving into the workforce. There's a lot of different cultural misunderstandings, issues as they move into the workforce that we are trying in our programs to address a little bit more. That's kind of where the background of that came from. This is a quick review of the generations. I studied sociology and psychology when I was in undergrad. A generation is basically defined as a group of children over about a span of 15 years whose childhood, so it examines their childhoods and what they went through during their childhood. The general category of generation, we think of the boomers. There's a lot of articles out there about millennials, and we'll get into some of that and what a millennial is because there's a lot of misdefinitions according to the theological articles that are coming out. Quick thing to remember, the generations are general categories. There's always exceptions. People don't necessarily fit into the category that they are a part of. But big thing to take away is that the generations are about 15 years long from start to end, and that particular generation experienced certain things in their childhoods that shaped how they perceive the world and how they participate in the workforce. There's also transitional years, so there are years that people may not quite neatly fit into one generation or another. And most of those are where you would start a new generation or just before it. So that's like 65, 80, 95, etc. Those years don't quite neatly fit into any category. And if you look at a lot of the surveys, 1980 will be considered millennials in one article, and then in another it's 1981. The reason is those years are where the transition from one generation to another, kind of the most, where they draw the cutoff. So these are the generations. 1928 and before, pre-1928, would be the greatest generation. Most of these people are going to be 90 plus. The silent generation is 1929 through 1945. The boomers are 1946 through 1964, 65 in there. Again, the 5 and the 0 years kind of, those are your transitional years. Gen X is 1965 or 1966 through 1979 or 1980. However you look at the surveys, it can vary. Same thing with millennials, that's 1980 through 1995. Interesting fun fact about millennials, they're much more likely to be teaching in your colleges than they are to be students at this point. And Gen Z, the youngest generation that we have a sociological name for, is 1996 through 2010. General time period that's considered to be that particular generation. With the greatest generation, the oldest one, they're the least likely to be in the workplace as of right now. Most students didn't finish high school. The students had high social cohesion. They were marked by the Great Depression impacting their childhood and adolescence. Most were adolescents who had been called on to participate during World War II, and segregation and racism were very common in the expectation. This was the generation that questioned it. The silent generation, they were the children during World War II, and you can kind of, as we're going through this, think about how these things in their childhood would affect who they would become later on. One of the thoughts on the greatest generation just before, the work ethic was very high. They had a very strong work ethic, And if you can see, they were the children of the Great Depression. And the children in the silent generation also, some of their childhood was during the Great Depression, World War II, qualities and things about this generation that was built on their childhood. For the silent generation, their children during World War II, desegregation began with Brown versus Board of Education in 1994. There was high scientific optimism and exploration. 1955, education became compulsory until the age of 14. Before 1955, most students did not attend high school, and in general, a lot of them did drop out in 8th grade, 7th grade, and would not complete high school. Vaccinations also began to become common during this generation, but many of them still remember having lost friends to polio and measles and other common childhood diseases of the time. The boomers. This generation gets a lot of attention. This is an older generation of today. It's the oldest generation that's likely to still be in the workforce. Many of them are at the end of their careers, but they're likely to still be in the workforce, and every now and then we still get a couple in our classrooms. Boomers were children during the Cold War, and they dealt with Cold War drills. They also experienced the Kennedy assassination, and children started to survive. Children started to survive in greater numbers due to medical advances. The boomers were the first generation to experience school integration. Their childhood was marked by the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King, Jr. The greatest generation is 1928 and before. The silent generation is 1929 through 1945, more or less. The boomers are 1946 to 1964. And then Gen X, which is we are moving on to right now, that one is 1965, more or less, to 1979. Gen X experienced the Vietnam War. They were the generation that it became very common to have television programming to most Americans. There were early computers that were beginning to be used in Gen X. They began to question a lot of the scientific research because they saw some of the results of technology. There was a lot of social unrest during their childhood. There was a lot of social unrest. There was a lot of rioting. There were a lot of things going on from 1965 to 1979 that affected the generation. There were also high levels of prosperity. Millennials. The big thing that marked millennials' childhood was September 11th, 2001. Millennials are about 1980 to 1995, so they would have been children or young adolescents when September 11th happened. They experienced the tech boom during their childhood, the end of the Cold War, the first Iraq War. They tend to be highly collaborative as many workplaces and many education circles started to incorporate much more collaboration. They were also the generation that experienced the birth of the Internet. Gen Z, or the iGen, you'll see them listed as different things in different places. They are most commonly where I see it is they're listed as Gen Z. This is our students for the most part. These are the students that are under 25, 1996 to 2010. These are the students that experienced the recession, which is a big part of what happened, what we found in how they think and how they perceive the world. Experiencing that recession during the childhood seems to have really affected this particular generation. The Gen Z also experienced Barack Obama's presidency. They were children during the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq. They have dealt with school shootings and drills growing up. There's widespread social media and tech accessibility. They also, and this is a really important thing to note about Gen Z, are the generation that the internet has enabled what's kind of known as the gig economy. They're contract jobs. A really quick note on Gen Z and the gig economy, or contract jobs that are coming up, is this is the first group there's a wide number of students in this generation. a lot of their jobs are like Uber drivers. With, again, back to a quick note on the gig economy, and this is really important. If you take a survey of a lot of your students, you can ask them how many of them are doing particular contract jobs. They may be working for Uber. They may be picking up groceries for Instacart. There are many of them that are doing things like Lyft, and they're collecting scooters, those scooters that we see on the streets. They basically like to work jobs that are convenient for them. And so doing a survey of a lot of these students, well, why do you want to work for this particular company? So that they can set their own hours and so that they can do what's convenient for them. They don't want to trade freedom working a job that they don't feel they're being paid enough for, it's an interesting mindset. So these students have grown up with the expectation that everything can be found online. They intuitively, as a group, rather than asking questions, will turn to the internet. And if they fail at Googling it, then they'll ask questions. Sometimes they may forget that other sources even exist. I've had students that will text me in the classroom. We use Remind, and occasionally they will send me a question while they're sitting in the classroom. Rather than raising their hands and asking the question, they'll send me the text and ask their question, which is interesting when you think about it. And a lot of times I'll read the question, then go talk to the student in the classroom. And I'll talk with them, and they'll be like, well, I tried to Google it, but I couldn't find the answer, so I thought I would just text. And my question has been, why don't you just raise your hand and ask me, because I'm right here? I think in some ways that's not their first impulse in many ways. They don't think to do that. It's not their go-to response a lot of times. So how that's affecting things is a lot of them will turn to the internet for jobs. And they do, so they're very good at using the internet. They can Google almost anything. They will watch. If they don't know how to do something, they'll watch a YouTube how-to. They do it much more creatively than many of the other generations would think to, because it's just been an ever-present source in their lives. My son is 6 right now, so he's a little younger than Gen Z, and he will ask Alexa for help on doing his homework, and will say stuff like, Alexa, what's 3 times 3? And then does his homework by using AI, basically. Older generations use the internet at varying levels, depending on when they were introduced to the internet. Has anyone else encountered students that would rather communicate via technology rather than ask? Okay, so Joe says very often. So it looks like this is actually a pretty common thing. A lot of the students, the younger generation, the students seem to prefer, and that is feedback that I'm getting from a lot of the students. They would rather text you than ask you the question in person. They don't like it when the phone rings, which is also another interesting shift in the culture. Because I think when I was in high school in the 90s, I liked to talk on the phone with my friends, and they don't really enjoy that. They would prefer to text in groups. They would prefer to talk on social media. Most of the younger students don't really want to talk with each other or ask questions. They'd rather tweet you or send you text. All right, some of the workplace expectations and questions. Due to cultural shifts, the younger generation are coming into the workplace with very different expectations. They don't expect to be at their jobs the rest of their life. In fact, they may think of the idea being at one job for a long term as boring. So some of the questions we have are, how do we prepare a disillusioned workforce for the market that is right now? And how do we help older workers understand where the younger ones are coming from? How do you explain, for example, Snapchat groups to some of the older workers? I talked with some of my students in the spring, and it turned out that a whole group of them, for one of the assignments, had formed a Snapchat group, and they were exchanging information, but they never actually met as a group for the group assignment. They just formed a Snapchat group, would post stuff, and then they turned it in. No issues. They did it well, but they never actually met in person with each other. They did everything over Snapchat. And how do we prepare the younger generation to be able to work with the older generation It's really important to understand where each group is coming from in order to work with others as a team or to work with them in general. Many of them don't understand that they need to be at a job in order to complete tasks. And this is one of the interviews I did for this presentation was with a manager at USAA, which is a large bank in San Antonio. She told me that some of the younger generation, that she had one particular worker in general that she was having quite a few problems with because he would text her and say that he was going to run errands and that he had already gotten his task list done, so he didn't feel he needed to be in the office. So the expectation of Gen X and older in a classroom or a workplace or meeting session is to be at the workplace, at a meeting, in person. While the expectation of a lot of the younger workers, they expect collaboration and they want to do so online. They're easily frustrated by older workers who may demand more independence. The younger workers see this as suspicious and are distrustful of corporations and businesses to a much higher degree than the older generation. So how do we help them to work better as a team with these very different mindsets? And what do we do with a lot of the younger generation as they come in with very, very different views and are very distrustful of corporations, many of them because they saw their parents lose jobs during the recession, and so they don't feel that they can trust necessarily a business or a corporation to take care of them. They will want to branch out and do things like Uber and contracts, entry-level jobs from home. And I think that was one of the most interesting things with the interview with the manager at USAA. She was explaining they have workers that don't really even want to show up. Like they feel like it's impinging on their time to come into the office while they could get these task lists done at home. And so they would much rather just log on the computer and not waste time. Kelly Meeks says that this is one of the reasons many of us boomers are still working, because of the corporation and the recession, yes. So workplace expectations and questions. Older generations will read instructions and try and figure out how to complete the task and the assignments in a checklist format. They'll generally accept that if it's written, that this is the way the job will run, and they won't argue too much about the requirements. Starting with the millennial students, especially, there might be some Gen X that would do this, but definitely starting with the millennials and younger. The students and workers may dispute and try and negotiate or attempt to negotiate their way out of whole sections of the instructions, including scheduling, due dates, and even whether or not they should do certain portions of it at all. In this, they may offer possible alternatives, and they will expect that the manager will enter into a negotiation with them and everybody will come to a collaborative conclusion. Have you guys seen this sort of reaction, this sort of negotiation with Gen X in the workplace or in the classroom? It seems to be a pretty common thing. Many of them, I don't know if you've given them your syllabus and then they look through it and then they try and ask like what parts they can get out of doing. Here's another note. I have a millennial coworker who procrastinates and ends up doing things at the last minute, and then he has to clean things up and turn in projects late. That's another thing we're hearing quite a bit from different employers, that they're, especially with Gen Z, there's a lot of negotiations. There's quite a bit of issues with the students and the new employees trying to negotiate for projects to be turned in at a different time than when they want them, when the managers say they need to be, trying to get their way out of meetings. A lot of those are issues, and one of the big questions in this is how do we, as educators, how do we help to teach them about work schedules and time management and work expectations? Educational expectations and questions. One of the big issues Joe Rodriguez notes that so many employers are allowing this type of behavior, and yes, that is another issue. There does seem to be a change in the workplace entirely, that there are being many exceptions allowed, and that there's a shift. There's a cultural shift that's happening. And because the workplace is bending to the younger generation and the expectations of the younger generation. And that's one of the issues of how much does the workplace bend and how much should the workers bend. And there's a dichotomy in that we really just don't know. Educational expectations and questions and attendance. Older generations are much more likely to stick with the job while they're becoming more and more frustrated and visibly expressing their frustration until it hits a breaking point. This can be more easily diffused by meeting with them and making an effort to communicate and expressing empathy with their needs. Younger students often do not let on when they are unhappy and will simply ghost out of classes, never to be heard from again. One quick note here on the concept of ghosting. I know this may be a term that you may be unfamiliar with, but that is becoming a very common issue in a lot of workplaces. This concept of ghosting is where the students just disappear. There's no 2-week notice. There's no, hey, I've got some stuff going on, I'm going to be out for this amount of time. They just disappear and are gone. And that's become actually a big workplace issue. A lot of the younger generation, this concept of ghosting is where they just disappear. So how it's affecting us in education is a lot of times some of these students will disappear and they'll be gone for a couple weeks. You have no idea where they are, and all of a sudden they'll reappear, maybe towards the end of the course, and will expect to be let back in the class and that they can just cram their way through the assignments and be okay. I don't know why that's considered okay, but it is a common issue. Are you guys seeing that in your classes? Have you seen that happen? Have you seen this ghosting behavior? Have you seen it? Because it's becoming quite a big issue in a lot of workplaces. The younger students, they have issues with ghosting. They lack connection to their workplace. There's just not a deep sense of, I work here and so I'm connected. It's much less connected than it has been in the past. There's a lot of not thinking the limits apply to them, and there is a sense of entitlement on the entitlement. We don't know if that's just because they're younger or because they actually are more entitled. There's just debate about that. But those are all issues. Kelly notes, I dislike entitlement. And yeah, that's one of the things that the older generations are always accusing the younger generations of. So there is debate over whether, how much more entitled they are, but they definitely seem to feel they're much more entitled to flexible work hours and flexible schedules and working from home, and they just don't have they don't want to do jobs that they don't feel are giving them, that they don't feel that their time is best spent, I guess would be the best way to put it. They don't like to feel like they're wasting their time. So 4 methods for the multi-generational classroom. There's empathy, there's collaboration, discussion, and empowerment. Boomers and Xers need to be able to voice their expectations of needing lessons and lectures, but will be guided to gradually let go on these expectations and progress in a modern classroom of learners. To be able to see this collaboration style is good for them, they will have to be given empathy for where they are. Millennials and Gen Z need empathy, and they need to learn to give empathy to their older classmates. This can involve discussions with older students so that they understand how much things have changed. Many of the younger generation of students, they do not know what life was like 30, 40 years ago, and they have no idea how to even conceptualize of some of the things that the older generation has gone through to make the workplace what it is today. So some of the flexibility, some of the negotiations, the salary, those are all, I guess, in many ways, they're battles that the older generations have. But the younger generation doesn't have any concept of realizing that that's not just something that's existed for all time. The next method is to ease into collaboration. Older students have often been out of school for a long time and put group work on the back burner for the first couple of classes to allow students to form natural groups. With the older generation, they're more comfortable. When they're more comfortable, it's easier to start mixing the groups. With the middle generation, the Gen X and older millennials, they may feel out of the loop with some of the topics that the younger students have as concerns, but they might not relate well to the older students either, and so they may be a bit wary of both. Younger students will often jump into group work with enthusiasm, but if it's not reciprocated, they often tend to ghost out and disappear. Easing them in a bit with their own generation often helps out with that. There's not a good cure for ghosting. We haven't found it. So if any of you have suggestions, that would be of what you might have implemented in some of your classrooms, you can put it in the chat box. One of the best ways to, method 3, don't be afraid to discuss the differences. One of the best ways to help guide students to seeing through each other's eyes and considering other perspectives is in guided discussion. Have you guys used guided discussion in your classrooms to get the students talking about some of the differences through that they're seeing in the workplace? There's a lot of good things how to do that, but it has been very effective in getting a lot of the younger students to kind of get an idea of what the workplace was like before so that they can kind of lower their expectations or prep them so that they're more willing to show up for things. They're more willing to make those social connections that they're pretty unwilling to do a lot of times. But one of the big things that we're finding in a lot of our classes is that we are having to show the students how to make social connections, how to talk with each other in groups rather than just, as a lot of them will want to do, is like Snapchat and talk with each other like a collaborative group online. And so getting them to do it in person can be a challenge. Do you guys have any questions on that or just observations? Have you thought about how to kind of promote that more so we can see more teamwork with the younger generations? Because that is a skill that we're needing them to develop. Another thing with discussion is getting the collaboration of the generations isn't an easy road, but it is one that when it's successful, a lot of the students, both the older and the younger, appreciate hearing why they see things a certain way and how those things came to be. And so it's actually been really successful getting them to have those discussions and talk with each other to figure out why the older generation may have these expectations and why the younger generation thinks that some of this is okay. Many of them, when they have those discussions, it's been very effective. Again, if you have any questions or anything, just go ahead and put that in the chat box. And the last method is student empowerment. Many of the most encouraging and impactful statements from students later on have been from boomers and Xers who have felt freed from the expectations they grew up with. Many of the older students take ownership of their education through independent research and collaboration, and it helps them have the self-confidence they need to succeed. Many of the younger generation, when they talk with the older generation, they're pretty good cheerleaders. They're excited. They're really encouraging to their older classmates that they can stick with it and they can make it. The younger students, upon understanding these differences, feel empowered to adapt and work to help the older students by being their natural cheerleaders. When they do this, they form deeper connections that make them more likely to stay and complete the class to the end. So one of the big things that we have found is that helping those students form those connections is one of the big things that keeps them coming. And I don't know how we can get it to employers, but that connection, that social connection, does seem to be a big key in dealing with some of the ghosting issues and other things that we're seeing. Again, There's lots of questions that we have, lots that we don't understand. How do we deal with a lot of this? But one of the big things that does seem to help with it is empowering the students to work with each other, and then that does build confidence that they can do it on a job later on. Okay, this is kind of a recap of just the last bit about the workplace and how they work together in the workplace and their beliefs. Do you guys have any questions, anything on the different generations and how to get them to work together, how to address some of the issues with Gen Z and their a lot of their tendencies in ghosting and some of those issues? A quick recap of things to understand within the generations of the workplace. Boomers value memory and discipline in educational settings. They need stability and they aren't great with change. Xers are self-reliant and competent. They're good independent learners and they're highly skeptical of change. Xers often value efficiency over perfection. Millennials are pressured to succeed and feel shame when they don't. They try and negotiate around the rules they don't like and creatively reinterpret instructions to match a better idea. They're much more likely to not recognize rules. Gen Z are much more explorative and creative. They have a lot of experiential ability to move easily between real and virtual worlds. They are both the most connected and the most isolated in both the workplace and the class.
It's really important to know all of these different qualities that our students from the different generations come with, because we as instructors, we as educators, we have to be prepared to deal with all of these generations because they're all coming into our classroom. So, Joy, we thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for listening.